Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this intro to community-driven planning session. I'm Jamie Love. This is Corinne Van Hook Turner. We are your but first, we will get started by welcoming Cassie to share some information about the Buildings Up Prize before we dive into the full presentation. And I see the slide is up for interpretation if you need interpretation services as well. So Cassie, turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Jamie, and thank you all for joining us today for this training session. Can we go to the next slide? So the Buildings Upgrade Prize, or Buildings Up, is designed to rapidly scale energy efficiency and efficient electrification upgrades to existing buildings all across the country. This is not a prize to upgrade a single building, but rather to develop an initiative that will complete many building upgrades in your building upgrade zone. The prize is envisioned to consist of 4 phases over approximately 5 years, subject to approvals and the availability of funds. We're currently in phase 1, which is the concept phase of the prize. And this phase will award over $22 million in cash prizes and technical assistance to teams. Applications for phase 1 opened on February 18th, and the application submissions will close on July 18th, 2023. We're seeking 20 to 60 winning teams to join the Buildings Up co-opetition. And we're calling it a co-opetition rather than a competition because we're not looking to crown a single winning team at the end. Instead, we hope to see as many teams as possible move through the prize phases successfully. To address this challenge, we're going to need all hands on deck, working together and sharing our best ideas with one another to move farther and faster together. An application support bonus prize is also open now to support new and under-resourced teams to develop and submit a phase 1 application. We'll cover the application support prize in a bit more detail later on in this webinar. Next slide. Buildings Up aims to address the persistent administrative, financial, social, and other barriers to energy efficiency and reducing on-site emissions from existing buildings. We have the technologies available to get there. We have efficient electric equipment like heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, and building efficiency measures such as insulation and air sealing, but we need to make these technologies more accessible. Only about 1 to 2% of buildings in the country are retrofitted for energy upgrades each year, which isn't nearly fast enough to meet our climate goals. We need innovations to address the non-technical barriers, the persistent financial, social, administrative, and other barriers to improving our buildings. Buildings Up is a capacity building prize that will support teams to develop solutions that accelerate building upgrades beyond current best practices, are scalable and replicable, are built to last beyond the period of the prize. The prize is structured to provide teams with support to ramp up their solutions, but teams should be developing solutions from the start that can continue on after the prize is completed. Buildings Up also seeks to benefit underserved communities by ensuring that at least 40% of the prize benefits accrue to equity-eligible buildings, their occupants, and the surrounding community. Next slide. Buildings Up applicants are asked to select one of 2 pathways. The Equity-Centered Innovation Pathway will award $400,000 in cash prizes for each winning team. For this pathway, teams will commit at least 80% of their building upgrades on equity-eligible buildings, which will be explained in greater detail on the following slide. The Open Innovation Pathway will award $200,000 in cash prizes for each winning team. For this pathway, applicants are not required to focus on equity-eligible buildings, but they may if they choose to. Technical assistance to build out concept submissions into implementation plans will be provided to all winning teams. Next slide. For the purposes of this prize, equity eligible buildings are defined in 4 categories to meet the requirements of the equity-centered innovation pathway. The first category is by geographic location. So this includes buildings located within DOE designated and climate and economic justice screening tool designated Justice 40 census tracts, tribal lands, and US territories. For the second category, that includes affordable housing and housing occupied by low-income residents. For the third category, that includes underserved commercial buildings, nonprofit, and public buildings. And then for the fourth category, that includes team-defined equity-eligible buildings. We recognize that there may be specific local conditions or considerations that could make certain buildings in a given area equity eligible that maybe doesn't fit under the categories that we provided. In the official rules document for this prize, in section 3.5, there's more details about each of these categories and ways that you can develop a local definition of equity eligible buildings. Next slide. So this slide provides several examples of different project types that applicants could propose for buildings up. For example, a community-based organization in a mid-sized town could partner with their local government to bring heat pumps to affordable housing buildings in their community. For all of these proposed initiatives, Buildings Up is especially seeking innovation and overcoming the persistent and non-technical barriers. I think it's also worth noting here that the minimum technologies and strategies for teams to include in their initiatives include efficient electric heating and cooling equipment, as well as weatherization and envelope improvements where it's needed to reduce energy costs. It's also worth noting that Buildings Up is specifically designed for upgrading many buildings in a given area and not just one single building upgrade. Next slide. Buildings Up is seeking innovation and overcoming challenges such as lack of contractor and occupant familiarity with technologies, high upfront costs for upgrades, insufficient workforce to scale upgrades, lack of reach of funding and incentive programs, and inconsistent quality of upgrades, among many other non-technical challenges. Next slide, please. The Application Support Prize is meant to encourage applicants who might otherwise not have the staff capacity, time, or expertise to submit a full Phase 1 submission. The primary intended competitors for the Application Support Prize are first-time applicants for DOE Building Technologies Office funding and community-based organizations representing or serving areas with equity-eligible buildings. Qualifying teams can apply for one of 50 prizes of $5,000 and 10 hours of technical assistance with our partners at Elevate to help them complete a Phase 1 submission. The Application Support Prize is currently open and has been being awarded on a rolling basis. The next deadline for the Application Support Prize is April 26th, and that will be the final submission date. There are 38 remaining prizes, or sorry, 27 remaining prizes for this final round. Next slide, please. So I encourage you all to head to the HeroX page after this webinar. It's available at the link shown here and by QR code. And once there, you can follow the prize, read the rules, set up your team, and apply for the Phase 1 prize or the Application Support Bonus Prize. The next full informational webinar, where we'll be going into a lot of detail about the logistics of the prize, the more depth of the prize rules, eligibility and scoring, is going to be on May 4th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And registration for that is available on HeroX. Next slide. So applicants to the Buildings Upgrade Prize will submit a series of 4 or 5 narratives, depending on which pathway they apply to. And together, each of these narratives, or altogether, these narratives can constitute your concept plan. Each of these narratives is scored based on the corresponding scoring criteria that are shown on the right. The information presented in today's session on community-driven planning is applicable to elements that are included in all 5 of the scoring criteria for the Buildings Upgrade Prize. Thank you all, and I'll hand it over to Corinne and Jamie.
Thank you, Cassie. All right, hello again. Welcome everyone. I am Jamie Love, Director of Programs with People's Climate Innovation Center. And you will also be hearing from Corinne Van Turner, who is the Director of People's Climate Innovation Center. And we are starting off today with an introduction to community-driven planning. We're doing this through the R2E2 initiative, residential retrofits for energy equity, which is a new nationwide initiative that's providing training to state, local, and tribal governments, as well as community-based organizations and partners to jumpstart energy upgrades for affordable housing that will lower utility bills, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve residents' health, create good-paying local jobs, and help advance racial equity. R2E2 is supporting the Buildings Upgrade Prize by providing these various technical training and technical assistance webinars and workshops for potential applicants and awardees. So we may be seeing some of you throughout this process at different sessions. So our objectives for today really are to understand the community-driven climate resilience planning tool and frameworks that we have developed. We will also familiarize you all with the spectrum of community engagement to ownership, and hopefully it will help you be able to identify the best ways to actually engage with community members, which hopefully is a top priority as you are going through this project and other work that you may be doing in community. And then also that participants will identify ways to build stronger connections between different agencies and partners. So working with local government, community-based organizations, and community members and leadership. So our agenda for the day, we had the welcome and overview. We'll be talking a little bit about the importance of communities leading and what that looks like. We'll be talking about climate resilience and what that means for People's Climate Innovation Center and how we approach climate resilience. And then the actual community-driven planning processes and framework, as well as the spectrum of community engagement to ownership before closing. So there will be a couple of interactive pieces, some things for you all to do during this session, and hopefully we meet the goals that we've laid out here. All right, so we really feel that communities have the right to define their priorities and their needs. And that's really how we operate as an organization. We believe that that is critical to actually doing community-driven planning work. And so that's our approach and the applied practice that People's Climate Innovation Center uses. And we do this because in order to create change, we feel that it's essential to really break down the typical top-down approaches for planning that are government-led, government-designed, and really start to center communities to lift up community leadership and community design so that it can be a planning process and solutions that actually meet the needs of community and meet them where they are. And so today we're going to talk about, some of the background on community resilience and walk through our framework for community-driven processes. But first, we'd like to hear from you all for what you think it looks like when community leads. So what is the best of the best? What happens when things are going really well, when there is community leadership, when there is a community-driven process? What does that look like for you all? And we'd love for you to put your answers in the chat, and we will call out a few of them. Community is active and involved. People show up. That's important. There's trust in the process. There's buy-in. Higher engagement, better program participation. Avoiding the savior complex. That is very crucial. Community mental health improves. Yeah, there's so many connections to having community-led processes. People are energized. We understand communities are decision makers. Community health, equity, peace, stability, co-opetition. There's a sense of ownership in the process. Tangible results, real solutions. I love these. All right, thank you all for sharing. And remember these things as you're thinking about why it's important and why it's critical to actually have community leading. So if we go to the next slide, we believe that power is participation in decision-making, and real participation actually changes the status quo. And that's a quote from Sherry Arnstein, who Corinne is going to share later, a tool that was inspired by Sherry's ladder of participation that inspired the spectrum of community engagement to ownership. And so we really are focused on, changing the status quo, actually giving community, not giving community power, actually lifting up community power and using that as a focal point. Next slide. And so what is climate resilience? Again, we're going to give a definition for how we define that in the context of our work, but we know that this term means a lot of different things to different people. And, sometimes it's meant positively, sometimes it's meant negatively. Everyone doesn't love the term resilience. So again, I invite you to drop in the chat some of your ideas of what does climate resilience mean to you. Being able to adapt to the changing climate, bounce back after a disaster, ability to endure, adaptive solutions and responses, flexibility to meet the moment, ability to withstand or thrive through the inevitable impacts of climate change. It means climate change is already here, and we should take steps to improve human flourishing in light of that fact. Adapt to climate change, but also equitable impact and adaptation. That's great. Oppression of EJ communities. Accommodation to reality. All right, thank you. So let's talk about what climate resilience means for us at Climate Innovation. Next slide. So resilience for us is actually captured in having all of these four things: adaptation, mitigation, social cohesion, and equity. We worked collaboratively with the Kresge Foundation and Movement Generation over a few years to really define climate resiliency as these things, and really understanding that resiliency is the opposite of vulnerability. So in general, vulnerability means dependency, and that's dependency on systems and structures that already inequitably dictate how, when, where, and who has access to essential life resources: food, water, electricity, shelter, all of the things that climate change threatens. And so when you have vulnerability and dependency, it's maintained by having those typical community engagement approaches, that don't really listen, that don't actually infuse community-led solutions and approaches. They're really kind of surface level engagement strategies. And so to achieve true resiliency, we have to shift from that status quo of engagement into a phase of community collaboration and community ownership over climate resilience planning and implementation strategies. And so that's why the equity and social cohesion pieces are a central part of climate resilience for us. And so when you talk about, what's really exciting about this definition is that it can bring together multiple bodies of work that inform community-based efforts, and tie that thread together. And so, for example, if you look at community gardens, they include mitigation because they're helping to localize food systems and therefore reducing carbon emissions. There's social cohesion built in there. So people are connecting with other community members when they meet each other in the garden, and they're starting to strengthen their relationships, their social capital, their networks. There's equity if they are actually being community-led and community-owned, and the practice of holding equity at the center so that folks all have a voice and access and the ability to participate in that garden setting. And then adaptation, they are making some foods affordable. There's healthy produce that's accessible, giving the rise in food costs. And so all of that is a form of adaptation. And so when thinking about, this more holistic approach, it's really that communities are the most vulnerable to climate change, are also those that have the least control over essential resources and the least access to decision-making structures that have an impact on their well-being. And so true resilience is really about reducing the dependency and the vulnerability through having that community control and community governance structure. So while dependency equals vulnerability, increasing resiliency means reducing vulnerability. And that is, the portion that we like to lift up with this definition. So why do we need community-driven resilience planning? It's really important given the urgent need to accelerate the pace of planning and implementation for climate solutions. And there's also really a clear need to cultivate more buy-in for climate resilience work and to develop more effective solutions. We know that often people don't even understand why climate change or why climate resilience might be important to them until it becomes tangible and they understand how it's impacting them and their communities and their everyday lives. So making that connection and then giving the opportunity for there to be a community-driven process really can help to accelerate the planning and climate solutions that we're trying to have. So right now, there are more and more cities in the US that are beginning to develop climate resilience plans. And a lot of times they bring in these corporate consultants and outside planners to help advise with the planning process. And so those folks may be focusing on reducing pollution or physical infrastructure, but they don't always take into account the knowledge and expertise that's right there in the community that are really vulnerable to climate disruption. They are receiving the impacts. And so they don't necessarily come up with solutions that are going to effectively reduce that vulnerability for those communities. And so a consultant may come in, but they may not be taking that more holistic approach. They aren't necessarily looking at the equity implications, distributing pollution and physical infrastructure, and how those things play out in a community and who's being impacted. And so they aren't focused also on the social cohesion. They're not looking at the networks, they're not looking at where people have relationships, and really are sort of siloing within that process as opposed to building out a connected network. So in order to reduce pollution and create new infrastructure, we really want to consider the communities of color that are impacted most by climate change, and how the physical infrastructure needs of communities of color may not be being addressed as well, and where there can be some changes that are really community driven and produced and lifted up. And so building new social infrastructure through that planning and implementation process that is shaped by community is really where we want to land, and why we believe community-driven approaches are crucial for climate resilience planning. And so when we look at the opportunities for community-driven planning, we know that it builds leadership outside of just local government agencies. Local governments can't do all of this work alone. They don't have the staff, they don't have the capacity, they don't have all of the expertise. And so being able to tap into the local expertise and the local knowledge really helps to increase the capacity of local governance, as well as creating multi-sectoral collaborations, multi-sectoral approaches, giving a deeper understanding of issues. People really come with a lens of understanding both the vulnerability and the assets that are in communities, and creating a wider range of possible solutions. And that really helps to create more buy-in for implementing the solutions, because people feel that their voices have been heard in the process, and it's getting reflected in what gets developed in those plans. It also helps to increase collaboration and leadership capacity. So again, because local governments can't do it all on their own, they need this additional structure and resources that they can tap into outside of just their staff that they have. And community-driven planning just fosters collaboration by its nature. And so having that approach will help to continue building that relationship, as long as it is done in an equitable and trusting manner, and helps to give, a deeper understanding of vulnerabilities and issues that exist, as well as creating more effective solutions. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corinne to actually walk through our community-driven climate resilience planning framework.
Thank you, Jamie. Hello, everyone. Corinne Van Hook Turner, she, her. As Jamie mentioned, I'm the director with People's Climate Innovation Center. While I cannot see every single one of the 187 people on this call, I've been perusing the participant list, and I do see some familiar names. So hello. and hopefully a little bit or a bit, right, of what Jamie has shared really resonates. I've been checking out the chat this, as we think about kind of some of these core pieces of concepts that Jamie have just shared with you, we wanted to kind of do that baseline understanding in this Zoom room, because we understand that when communities come together, we're all coming from different entry points, different levels of our expertise, different levels of our experience. So thank you, Jamie, for, again, establishing that baseline of what we will be inviting you into as you all think about how you're forming teams, what the current work that you're already engaged in looks like, right? We really want to think about, if we think about resilience, right, we're really leaning into the assets of the work that already exists in our communities, the priorities and needs that are being addressed by community-based organizations who are in direct collaboration with the communities and the residents that will benefit and that need access to these benefits. So it's really important for us to just really ground in what we mean so that we can be clear about the work ahead. As Jamie said, community-driven planning, really fundamentally shifting top-down planning systems, which are generations old. That is our jam here at People's Climate Innovation Center. And really what is a great launch point and really core framework and tool is this community-driven climate resilience planning framework, which, again, if we think about what it really does take to think about governance in a way that is community-led, community-driven, community-owned, we know that that's going to take all of us and that we all have a role to play, right, in this design of just a new way of building better buildings, right, building better policies, and building thriving communities. So just to give a little bit of context about how we came up with these concepts, right, it really was rooted in the experience of community-based organizations. I will say we were one of them. Rooted in Resilience is listed here in this framework. I'm going to go ahead and pop in just a link for you all, because I will encourage you. There are, aside from just the concepts shared in the approach of community-driven climate resilience planning, which we're going to invite you to think about to apply today, there are just a whole range and list of tools and highlights from our partners in here who were co-developers of the framework, and also have tools and work highlighted for actually what it looks like. So I would encourage you, not right now, but I would encourage you to take a deep dive if you haven't already, and really workshop some of these things just beyond the concepts itself, because they really are useful. And we acknowledge that some of these things you might be oriented to be like, oh, I'm doing that. And again, we really don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are things, there are resources that exist. So again, a lot of this work started kind of the co-development, I would say, gosh, back in 2013, 2014, I say that as an organization that came into the earlier conversations to really acknowledge that planning doesn't just happen within an institution. Planning doesn't just happen within a 9-to-5. As Jamie said, right, like resilience, social cohesion, engagement really does happen just on the day-to-day, right? And how we build and how we actually navigate our environments and even navigate the built environment, right? If we think about like what buildings are, what they're used for, what they mean to us functionally, and how that can really just basically translate to like, how does that then address our needs as we're thinking about innovations, or if we're thinking about like how to, again, improve some of the quality of life impacts of climate, right? So we came together, long process, right? The great thing about planning is that it never stops, it never should, right? As we think about and reflect on what's working for our communities and what we can do better. So after, across the country, grassroots organizations, community-based organizations came together to really think about the solutions that they were already working on in their communities, to really co-develop these concepts. We launched this framework in 2017. Complementary to that though, right, much like many tools and resources, which there are so many of, right, that we can point to, it was really important for us to build a community of practice around this work. If we are thinking about how to fundamentally shift a system that is generations old, that is rooted in oppression, that is rooted in extraction of our economies, extraction of our labor, then we really have to make a commitment to continue to do the work. And doing the work means practice, and doing the work means dissemination of these tools and just a new way of doing things. And that's going to take time. We're going to have mistakes. We're going to learn from them, we're going to get better, but that is going to take time if we are going to meet that and really ultimately have the transformed systems that we're wanting to have. So all that to say is that even though we launched this in 2017, we've been able to do some great work in progress, but we still have a long way to go, which is why the Buildings Up opportunity is just really a great, this again, we're going to have initiatives, we're going to have solutions that are coming up left and right? We look at public funding opportunities and the movements we've made there. And it's really important for us to actually think about how we can be leveraging as much as possible these new approaches to how we're wanting to govern and really making sure that we're putting communities front and center in these types of opportunities to really include them, but more so not include them, make them designers, right? Designers of these policies and these efforts that we want to see. And so that really is the invitation here with this framework. And that's the invitation here for what we want to talk about today. Normally, a framework workshop can be done in, I would say, a half a day, hours. We don't have that, unfortunately, the luxury of that and the time. So I am going to be brilliant, and I'm going to try to be, brilliant, hopefully. And I'm going to be a little bit brief with you all in some of this. It won't be a deep dive, but we're hoping to give you just a little bit and just enough for you to feel oriented to kind of what we're offering and what we're inviting into this space. So again, just a little bit about our framework. The community of practice you see there is the National Association of Climate Resilience Planners. And again, this is a network that we're building of facilitators, right, of community-based organizations who are our founding members who played a significant role in co-developing this tool and have tools of their own. And so what we want to assert here is that we actually are building a network so that this tool, much like, unfortunately, many, does not just sit on a shelf, but that actually does take a moment to make some of those key shifts that we are looking for. You're not seeing the slide, Tamara. We are going to advance to the slide. The slide you should have been seeing was the framework. I wanted to just take a moment since we were talking about the concepts of the tools. It's okay. We can go ahead and go to the next one. So when you get deep into the tool, you're going to notice that there's a whole web of community-driven planning that has, all of these different components. But core to that is really the essential elements of community-driven planning. And what we found in this framework is that we really do need to assert with what is a community's vision? What are we wanting to do? What are we wanting to achieve? What does it actually look like if we are thriving and we have healthy buildings, accessible buildings, right? And not just buildings, anything, right? We were talking about food, we were talking about gardens, we were talking about energy, right? What does it mean to own our systems? And all of this really does start with a community vision when we think about our needs and our priorities of ultimately asking community, what is it that you want? What is it that you need to have a quality of life? And from there, we want to start thinking about how do we actually then, if that is our vision, build the power necessary. So you'll see there on the right, having the influence and decision-making authority given or not, in traditional seats, and also to produce changes. So we want to think not just in terms of how are we asserting what we want at a community level in terms of a vision of what we want, but also we have to acknowledge that we're navigating the existing systems we're trying to transform. So actually, while there is power situated in communities, right, making sure that they take seats at the table, whether they're invited or not, making sure that they are bringing attention to the core issues and priorities in their communities. We also want to acknowledge that there are folks that situate within institutions, within government, that actually hold power of their own, right? So how are we actually coming and aligning around a shared vision? And from each of our roles, understanding how to make sure that there is that power building happening, both on the inside of where decision-making power and policies and resources are held and then disseminated and distributed, but also making sure that we're giving room to communities to be in those seats and to be defining some of those decisions, or at least taking a step to actually think about how are we actually implementing some of what the feedback or the engagement practices we might employ into some of these decisions, in order to then inform, as you see on the left there, the solutions, right? The solutions that are actually important to our community, because there should be a direct relationship between the two. So I just wanted to kind of call attention to what we call our essential elements. It's also called the engine of community-driven planning in our framework. Next slide. So the distillation of 5 principles. So we've talked a little bit about the framework. We've talked a little bit about key concepts. And through this work, it was really important to lift up that with a lot of the leading practitioners doing this work, we were able to together think about what are the 5 principles distilled for actually doing this work. And I saw in the chat earlier with Jamie's invitation that actually folks were drawing a little bit about what are the cultural values that actually lead this work. And this speaks actually not just a little bit to that, a lot of it to that when we think about, yes, I sometimes make up terms, a lot of it. We think about what are the different principles and practices that are actually going to help us think about how we do this work. A big one is whole systems thinking, right? That recognizes that climate change impacts, as Jamie said, really is about all aspects of our society, right? So as she mentioned, it's energy, it's water, it's food, it's systems. And what that requires is a holistic understanding of the complex challenges in order to address the complementary complex solutions, right? And if any of us are familiar with permaculture and permaculture practices, right, you might even think about the problem is the solution, right? Sometimes there should be and can be a direct relationship when we think about that. Now, what does this mean for resilience to the buildings upgrade prize or building up in this particular opportunity is actually if we think about, if we were to make improving buildings in these ways, the ability to think about how we might use less energy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions that actually contribute to climate change, that another way to think about that is we can also reduce energy bills and improve comfort for building occupants, right? So we're thinking about what are the comprehensive win-win solutions when we think about whole systems thinking, right? It's not just about this very specific thing about a building, but actually what is in relationship to the different things that either a building sits on, how we navigate a building, and it's not just buildings alone, right? So really thinking about how all of that connects. We also want to call attention to desired outcomes reflected in every step, right? Outcomes and principles such as equity and community-derived planning that actually should be embedded in every step of the planning process. We want to, again, as I mentioned, planning should happen all the time. It's also a learning process. So it's required that, not required, but it's actually essential that we actually foster multi-dimensional learning across governance levels, meaning that learning can go across and between stakeholders. So really taking a top-down approach and really leveling that to a kind of a cycle of how we're doing some cross-learning across various forms of stakeholders to really increase our understanding of the causes, the consequences of climate disruption so that we can better navigate what are the processes and pathways to address it. And then we also want to think about planning into action. We want to make sure that everything is in place for implementation, right? So we have to think about, okay, do we have the resources, right? So if you think about the prize, right, it was really important for us to say, if some of us need resources to get started, let's actually provide some access at the very beginning, right? So that folks can tap into that as they're thinking about their plan, as you all are planning your teams. We also have to think about capacity. What are we realistically able to do, given that we are working on things that may not be this specific opportunity, but that may, given the work that we're already doing, be an opportunity that can advance the work that's already happening. And then really thinking about other forms of resourcing, right? Technical assistance that we may not already hold in our organizations or in our institutions, right? The community-driven planning being able to open that up because we're all bringing in different expertise together to do some collaborative work. And then some of that leadership readiness, right? How are we building in just new forms of leading, right? If we're thinking about communities first. And then, of course, when we think about collaboration, much like anything else, we got to think about balancing power dynamics. We got to talk about power, right? We have to understand that there's a procedural aspect of this where we want to increase awareness of systems and oppression. I saw some of that in the chat, and exclusionary practices and culture. I also saw some of that really just because it's generations old and our systems are perpetuated by habits, right? That we actually acknowledge that there are power imbalances that will continue to contribute to the climate vulnerability, and that will continue to perpetuate those that hold power in decision-making in the planning process. And we really want to allow for community groups to really increase, right, disrupting some of those habits so that they can step into that power. And then there's the substantive, right, increasing access and control over essential resources at the community level to reduce vulnerability and power imbalances. So just to break down a little bit, I wanted to ask you all, as I've kind of oriented to some of these principles, what, based on the work that you all are doing or engaged in, what's challenging, and next slide, about community-led planning processes, and what principles do you most connect with and why, or how might they show up in your community and in your work? Everyone believes in top-down so much in terms of what's challenging. Maybe speaking to the habits. It's easier. What else? It is most challenging to get folks invested. I love respecting community and shifting power dynamics. Yes, yes. So it really is just about this practice, right? Even the practice itself is challenging. Maintaining momentum. Yes, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Hamish principles. Yes. Getting the word out and bringing residents together. Yes. So keep those coming, right? I'm going to go ahead and transition us, right? Because what we're really then thinking about is like, okay, there are these principles, right, that lead our work. And sometimes it's really important. We've actually found that in doing community planning work, oftentimes communities are invited to a meeting and they've got all these technical terms, and then they say, well, we would care about what you think, and so tell us. And we don't know if we necessarily have everyone in the room that we should have in the room. And then maybe plans happen and maybe information gets taken, decisions get made, and really there isn't a thorough point at which community has been brought along through that process. So those are some of the challenges that we kind of want to just have some more practice, right, and get a little bit better about. And so the next slide, the framework being one tool, one thing that we recognize in its co-development and in a lot of the highlighted tools within it was that we really then did need to Sherry Arnstein's point, right, about participation is that participation is power, but it has to be authentic, right? We have to actively be doing it. And so here is a tool that in a moment, I'm going to invite you all to do a little bit of workshopping around. It is called the Community Engagement to Ownership Spectrum Tool. It was co-developed and designed by Rosa Gonzalez at Facilitating Power with Movement Strategy Center, who is our former fiscal sponsor, where our organization's work grew out of in the development of this tool. And so we created it because there was a need to hold accountability to the process in order for us to think about how are we doing this work, right? How are we assessing how we are doing this work? And how are we designing our programs, our policies, our efforts and initiatives in order to do it, right? And so what this framework does is it really does bring together participation at each stage to really understand and highlight what is the experience and what are we actually moving toward at every stage, right? So over there on the left, you see inform, right? Maybe we're providing the community with relevant information, right? Then as we go up, we're like, oh, we might consult, we might gather input from community, right? And then 3, right? We might involve community, we might ensure that community needs and assets are integrated into the planning process and maybe inform planning. And then collaborate, right? As we think about, okay, if we've consulted, they've been forming some of our process, how do we actually get to a place where we've actually created a system by which we have built enough of our capacity for communities to actually play a leadership role in the implementation of decisions. And then 5, a goal really to then defer to. How do we foster democratic participation? This is the new form of governance that we're thinking about, right? And so we want to also hold that while each of these stages of the tool can imagine how we might interrupt different points of marginalization, really, or levels of access that might be limited, that in doing so, we want to build capacity for community ownership at each stage. We want to think about how we're actually doing each stage of this work, and then think about breaking down the barriers to participation along the way, which will build capacity to community ownership, which again is like that huge long-term goal. The other thing to note, though, that while is assessing where we are in each of these stages, next slide, we want to also think about that each stage can also hold traps that contribute to us doing the same things, right? Again, this is an assessment tool, but it is meant to be a design tool along with it so that we can chart a pathway to really thinking about how we might set some goals to move through the spectrum to really do the authentic engagement that is going to actually benefit some of the policies, the programs, the opportunities like this Buildings Up Challenge, so that we can then build toward what we're wanting. And so just to give you a little bit of an example, one way in which we might consider, okay, if we think about building up, if we think about how we want to build some of our local teams, what does that mean in terms of where each of you, right, understanding your work, are situated within how engagement happens in your work, right, as you're looking at some of the examples. And so while I've given a little bit about each of the stages, right, and what it might look like, maybe we're getting some information about from our communities, but again, where is that information going in terms of how we share it back, in terms of how we're showing community that not only have they given their time, right, and their expertise in an accessible way where they can actually show up and give their voice, but that actually what they've offered, what they've contributed are actually making it into the plan, or it's making it into the policy. So what's the follow-up mechanism? And if we can start to identify that, then we can start to understand how we're making key shifts to break down some of those barriers and move to the spectrum of involve and collaborate, which is really what you want to think about here when you're thinking about your formation of your teams, right, for this challenge, and also all the different priorities that you saw in that table for what you're wanting to build toward to have a successful proposal and plan. And so at the bottom there, you're also going to see the resources, right? As Jamie said, that there are resources that need to be, again, decentralized and distributed equitably if we are to actually encourage active participation. So you'll see there at the bottom, you'll see that as we go and move up each stage, the resource allocation ratios, the systems admin, all of those things are going down because we are shifting the resources required for communities to step up, to step in, and to lead. And so now I want to take a moment and time. I just want to do a check because I know we have to do some next steps. So what we can do is I'm going to go ahead and thank you, Carolyn. We've got the PDF there for the tool. I'm going to go ahead and invite in this link share here. And we're going to give just a couple of minutes for you all to then think about each of the various stages. So in the chat, I've put a document that as you're thinking about the challenge itself, you're thinking about the Buildings Up, you're thinking about the work you're already doing and how you might leverage the Buildings Up challenge, and then apply a tool like this to think about what your engagement needs to be and what are some next steps and to make some goals around it. This document here, which again is view only. So if you want to work in this document, I would encourage you to make a copy if you want to work directly in it through some of these steps, or to, a piece of paper, depending on how you work, or another document, to really think about how would I map, reflect, assess, and set some goals around naming some activities along each of the stages of the spectrum. In terms of the very bottom, right, 0, which is ignore, what barriers to participation do our communities face? all the way through 4 and 5, which is who are the community partners, the members, the CBOs that I might work with to best equip and engage the voice and power of residents that Building Up aim to serve. And which ones are we currently partnering with, right? And how do we actually think about some of those things to actually inform how we're doing our planning for this effort or how we're forming our teams for this effort? And then at the bottom, you're going to then do a reflection. What are the strengths you're seeing? What are some of the gaps you're seeing? In terms of assessing where you are in your engagement and where you want to be, particularly for planning for this effort, and what's realistic for that timeline. And then think about what are some of the goals. So you'll notice, and if you scroll all the way down at the bottom for my Spanish speakers, there is a Spanish version of this very document to do all of these activities that I have just been talking through. And then you want to kind of set some goals. And think about setting some goals that feel realistic for how you might leverage the Buildings Up challenge, if that is something that you're really like coming to this call of like, I don't want to just build my capacity for opportunities like these in the future, but I want to see if we could build our capacity to leverage some of the work we're doing now in order to take advantage of this Buildings Up prize. I'm going to leave you with that because of time. And because I don't think we have 10 minutes, given we have to do some of the next steps. So that is a gift that we are going to leave you with before we transition to just a few more next steps for you to take advantage. Oh, we can go until 2:30. Okay, so I am getting a note that we actually can give you some time. I thought that we didn't have enough time. So we're going to go ahead and take about 10 minutes now for you all to actually workshop what's in this document here. And in workshopping what's in this document based off of this spectrum tool, you can go ahead and let's go ahead and leave this slide up just so folks can see some of the examples across each of the stages of the spectrum. Please feel free to reference it if you need to, but you'll notice that in the document that I shared that all of those key questions along the stages of the spectrum are there to elicit how it aligns with each of these spectrum stages, right? So depending on what works best for you, feel free to reference the document itself or also this if you are a visual person. And then really go through each of those prompts. So we're going to come back in about 10 minutes. I'm going to give y'all some time to work on that. And then I want to hear back just from a few of you, maybe in the chat, to kind of share what are some goals, what are some of the strengths that you all are noticing in terms of building around the buildings, not building around, but actually thinking about the Buildings Up challenge. Okay, starting to wrap up. I know this is just a little brief moment to do some thinking with this tool. And again, my attempt here was to be hopefully brilliant, definitely brief in how we are taking a look at some of how we might apply some of these tools, understanding that we want to do some deeper dive in thinking and really sit with these tools. So we've provided them in the chat. More resources will be provided later. And hopefully this provides a little bit to get started. So with that, I want to invite to see what's come up for folks based on how far you've gotten in the document. Has anyone got as far to set some goals, perhaps? Or maybe think about an assessment of, before getting to the goals piece, what's coming up for you there? And please feel free to go ahead and put that in the chat. We want to hear from some of you all. I'll give one example relevant to a building decarb project at the national level we were working on. And I'm seeing some Q&A, and hopefully this will respond to that in the chat as we can think about it later, is just the challenge of time. Oftentimes these planning processes, which is why planning should happen all the time along the way, they in and of itself take time. And not everyone has the capacity to prioritize their time. So sometimes when we think about partnering with community-based organizations and we're really mapping our partners, we want to be transparent up front to really think about, if a CBO is working on this already, is this a part of their theory of change? Is this the work that they have already engaged their communities around? That way we can meet them where they're at and maximize their time. Like, what's the value to how an opportunity like this one might translate to meeting some of the priorities of their current efforts? And I think from that place, we can then have a conversation to then work together to think about how additional resources from an opportunity like this might actually meet the needs of both sides to actually form a team to start working together and build collaboration. Another piece of that, though, is to understand that flexibility in timelines is crucial. And I'll honor an example that happened, again, relevant to projects like these around building decarbonization, where there were these tangible, I would say untangible timelines that were arbitrary. They really didn't mean anything. It was just like our habit to want to set timelines to things. So one thing that I would offer is that to where we can be flexible with time, understanding that planning process is learning process. And if we invest in it, if we invest another time in that, then the long run will be easier because we've done some of that legwork and we took the time to invest in that in the beginning versus really rushing through to meet a timeline without really understanding what the purpose we were meeting was. And then we end up having to go back, right? Which actually ends up taking more time in the long run. So I think, again, being transparent about who's making decisions, who holds power, what these timelines actually mean. Like, are they arbitrary? Are they movable? An example of that was that I was able to then help a CBO not only increase the funding of their scope because there just wasn't enough. It was like half the amount they needed, right? But also the community was able to step in and say to the city, hey, actually, this is what we're working on, and this is our scope. So they basically rewrote the scope, and then they landed together to then think about, how do we move that forward? And how do we start from a place of engaging the residents we're already working with to define some of the priorities of the building's work in the ways that we're thinking about it, and then apply that to this project. And so just wanting to give an example of, like, in the context of this tool, how it might look and how we might think about who we identify to partner with. All right, in the chat, I've got some stuff. All right, so participation of volunteers contributes to building and community together with the project. Yes, participation of volunteers. And I would also probably add that we probably want to offer, what are the resources? What do people need to participate? You know, if we think about resources, time is a very, very finite one. And we want to make sure that everyone feels as though they have that access to come to the table and to give their time. And if we need to resource that, if we need to provide stipends, if we need to provide food, if we need to provide honoraria, if we need to set up contracts and agreements. Do we have another? Anything else? We are Linda. Okay, we are at about the involve, collaborate stage. 80% of our buildings are historic or contributing to the history of the area. Yes. And Linda, did you identify, given the rich history of those buildings, what is the community in that place, the place-based community work happening there in relationship to some of those buildings? Is that still alive? Is the cultural fabric still intact, right? Is there a way in which we can leverage the strength of what exists in that place, given the history of that, for a collaboration like this? You know, are there partners there leading some of that work to keep some of that preserved? Are the original members of those communities still there, right? Because we think about buildings, and, you know, one implication of buildings is displacement, right? Are we building for the communities that are there? Or, you know, possibly are we running the risk of not allowing folks who have been here to stay here? And we want to make sure that we're protecting that social cultural fabric. All right, so keep those coming. House of Worship, we're currently meeting monthly as a coalition with the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition. Would we qualify as a state? So I think we are actually starting to transition into some of our next steps. where we are going to get a little bit deeper into some of the Q&A. So thank y'all for taking a moment to engage with this tool. I think that you've started a good process to continue to actually thinking through some of these stages and also how it might apply. And next slide, I'm going to go ahead and think about with this webinar today, well, what's next? So April 12th, we've got a webinar at 12:30 Eastern that will focus on assessing funding for affordable housing and equity eligible commercial building upgrades. April 14th, we've got a training webinar, 1 p.m. Eastern, that will focus on energy efficiency programs 101. April 26th, training webinar, 1:30 p.m. Eastern. That will focus on considerations for underserved commercial buildings. April 28th, training webinar, 1 p.m. Eastern, drivers of energy efficiency and affordable housing. And then May 4th, there will be an informational webinar at 11 a.m. Eastern. And so you'll see the QR code there. You can go ahead and reference that or scan it to also get access to those webinars if you don't already. And with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and one more slide, actually, before I pass it on over to you, Ethan. Office hours. So we've got some upcoming office hours along with the webinars, April 20th, 1 p.m. Eastern. Some of those topics covered there will be engaging stakeholders across sectors. So again, think about these tools as you'll get some support in actually how do you do that with some of the communities you might be connected to already. Introduction to comprehensive retrofits and prize and application questions. So bring some of the ones that you've highlighted today there. The week of May 1st, which is also TBD specifically in terms of time, topics covered there will be, again, introduction to community-driven planning, assessing funding sources for building upgrades, energy efficiency programs 101, prize and application questions. May 15th, 2:30 Eastern, topics covered, considerations for underserved commercial buildings, drivers of energy efficiency and affordable housing, prize and application questions. So again, you'll see there the QR code on the right, and I see an Eventbrite that is put there. I also see Carolyn in the chat dropping some helpful links. So again, these are some office hours that will be complementary to some of the webinars to help support you all. And with that, I'm going to pass it on over to you, Ian. Thank you, everyone. I think we have a poll for you all. Great. So if you all can take a moment to complete that. And as you all do that, I want to offer my thank yous, my appreciation on behalf of myself and Jamie and the People's Climate Innovation Center, and also the R2E2 and Buildings Up opportunity.
All right, folks, now that we have the poll results, we can move on to the Q&A. So we got a lot of great questions in the chat. We'll just take them one by one. So there are a number of questions that were answered in the chat. We'll go over some of those as well, so they were included in the recording. So the first question is for Cassie. Will the slides be available after the presentation? How do I get a copy of the slides? That's been asked by a lot of folks.
Yes, I think the R2E2 team will be sending out the slides and materials afterward. I believe that's great.
And those will go out in English and Spanish to registrants. And then there was a question about the extension of the prize support application, whether the deadline was April 14th or April 26th.
It's April 26th. So originally the deadline was April 14th, but it's been extended to April 26th. And there are 27 prizes left. So we encourage you to get your applications in.
And another attendee asked if there will be a list of other attendees on this call for the purpose of building a team.
And we're not able to provide that information since that's personal. We don't have permissions to provide that, but there are opportunities on HeroX to identify other teams and participants, and there may be some opportunities in the future, hopefully to have some networking opportunities.
And someone asked, who can I reach out to as a resource should I have questions later?
There's an email address. It is the buildingsup@nrel.gov, and that's NREL.gov email inbox, and that's where you can send any questions that aren't addressed here, and those will get answered.
And someone noted in the chat that or in the Q&A that they've had some trouble understanding who the other folks are in their region that are interested in the prize on the website. So the question is, what can participants do to connect with people and teams in their region?
Yeah, and that's a great, that was some great feedback for us to receive. I'm definitely going to take that one back to the team and figure out, how we can best address that. HeroX is one way to identify other teams that are participating, but you're right, it's not very easy to find the locations of those teams. Another thing that we were planning on doing is having some events later on for teaming and identifying potential partners that could participate on your team. So updates on all of that will be posted to HeroX.
And the next question is it realistic to think that a small CBO or nonprofit is able to compete with bigger organizations that have more ability to meet all the criteria required for the grant if they have actual grant writers on staff?
Yeah, and for this one, I just want to emphasize that is such a valid question. And there's a couple of things I want to mention in this response. The first being that, the design of this prize, so it's a prize and not a grant program, and that's very intentional. Prizes are a lot simpler than grants. It's simply, you fill out the application online, and then if you're selected, you receive the funding, and there's no strings attached. There's no documentation that's needed afterward. It's a lot less of a lift than a grant is. So prizes are intentionally more easy to navigate, and that was a very intentional choice on our part, because we do want to make this, something that communities can participate in. Also, this first phase is kind of designed to be, we're looking for good ideas. We have the different criteria in the rules, and it's meant to be sort of a lower lift with the intention that folks that are selected during this first phase will have opportunities to build out their ideas and receive technical assistance and support all along the way to actually develop an initiative. So that's why this first phase is really just this, developing this initial idea and this concept. And then a major resource I want to point out that's especially intended for community-based organizations is the Application Support Prize. And that's the prize that has this final deadline of April 26th. And that's the one where we have 27 prizes that are left. And that prize includes $5,000 in cash and 10 hours of technical assistance to help under-resourced teams to develop their applications for phase one. So I really want to highlight that and encourage folks to apply who are under-resourced and need that extra support. And the application for that is meant to be a pretty low lift as well. It involves, stating the need, and providing kind of a little bit more details on the types of equity eligible buildings that you plan to upgrade in your overall concept. So really want to highlight that. Another potential option that we really encourage too is for teams to partner with others and kind of build out that, you know, that capacity through partnering and developing your teams of multiple sectors to kind of provide that additional support. But happy to let others chime in too. Corinne or Jamie, have any thoughts on that?
So it sounds like we can go ahead and move on to some other questions. I know we're running a little short on time, so we'll do our best to make sure we address all the questions. This next question is for Jamie, and it was talking about referencing social institutions that bind populations together for generations in the face of climate disruption, temperature changes, and indirect impacts on economies, populations, institutions, and governments. We kind of reframe this question as how can community-driven planning help to address or disrupt social institutions that have continuing impacts on people, economies, social relations, and climate? So it's a broad question, but very, very relevant question.
Sure, thanks for that. You know, I think that's the reason for the purpose of having community-driven planning. So some of those social institutions are, you know, that top-down approach. It doesn't apply just to government only. Those institutions still are using that top-down approach of making decisions for community without that community involvement and leadership. And so using a community-driven model where there is a partnership, you do have community leaders and the necessary you know, institutional and government partners at the table so that you have a cross-sectoral approach, but they are not the decision makers. They are not the ones that are driving it. It is being community-driven, community-led, and addressing the needs and issues that have been identified by community in order to put forward. And so that would be the difference and the reason in why using a community-driven approach really can help to address some of those historical and systemic issues that some social institutions have left.
And I would add, as far as tools, I'm going to go ahead and drop our the link to our resources page. So we did a focus today on community-driven planning from the framework that was, again, specifically for a community audience, right? To then invite, how do we apply some of these things within a government context? We partnered with Urban Sustainability Directors Network, who also has a complementary tool that can kind of address some of the things that Jamie just spoke of from that perspective, right? Again, this tool is definitely relevant to working with governments, but also that tool can be of use as well. There's also a tool, an equitable buildings framework as well in there that we worked on that also touches on some of what Jamie brought up, if you want to take a look at that. Thanks, Jamie.
And we have 1 minute left, so maybe we'll leave it at this last question. How do you deal with this is for Corinne, how do you deal with the barrier of time for the community participation and ownership? That was one that we didn't answer in the live chat.
I'm on mute. Yes, so I mean, the barrier of time is just a reality that I think we need to acknowledge exists. You're not necessarily going to get everyone, but this is, and I think you all saw an earlier webinar around a process tool we call ecosystem mapping, and really finding who is your kind of core partner CBO that is already working in communities to engage them so that, again, we can, you know, adjust for the barrier of time by leveraging some of the community building events or activities or ways in which information flow. Often community-based organizations situated within their communities already know they have that information. So one entry point is to just connect with them directly, right? To kind of get that information. Oftentimes, some of that information has already been collected, right? And so that can speak to not having to, again, just pull and collect that information again. Another process by which we can help with some participation is, if we are hosting an event, like this one, for example, making it accessible, knowing either by connecting with our community-based partner, if folks are going to be working during the time we're going to have an event to, get some participation that we're hosting it actually where the folks already go, right, in their neighborhoods, looking at events that are already happening and maybe reaching out and asking if, you all can collaborate and have some space. Again, the permission is key, right? They may have a packed full agenda. So it's really just about figuring out, is there an opportunity for you to be able to, engage with participants for understanding that time can be an issue. Another thing is that in terms of participation, under holding arbitrary timelines, I think I mentioned this really lightly. If there can be flexibility as much as possible, let's kind of loosen those up a bit and be really, really clear about the information we're collecting and on what time. Also be clear about the gaps of the information that you're collecting as well if you weren't able to get everyone. Because really, when we think about participation, especially community ownership, that it requires just a long-term investment of time, because we also, in addition to our time, have to be putting in the resources that are needed to build the infrastructure for communities to step in and to have ownership over them. And again, that takes time, that takes trust, that can take years, literally years. However, if you're starting from a place of partnering with an effort that exists already, right, situated within that infrastructure, that's one way to account for some time, right? Understanding that communities have this work done already. So it really is just about finding the right partners who are working on this already. And so I think that's why we encourage partnerships with CBOs, because they have already established those working relationships.
So I think we'll have to leave it there because we're over time. Thank you, everyone, so much for attending. And if you have any additional questions, please email the email that's in the chat, buildingsup@nrel.gov. Thanks so much.
Thank you.